Hi guys, so I need to thank Dan's White, Virgo 1986 FUL, and Julia Rose for recommending this case. I also need to provide a warning, as this video is about the abuse and murder of a very young child, and it's harrowing, so please click off now if this will distress you. After this, I'll probably leave covering these types of cases for a while, as they're emotionally draining, but Star Hobson's story needs to be told. Anyway, on with the video. Star Hobson was a beautiful little girl, pure and innocent. She should have been protected, but she wouldn't see her second birthday. As on the 22nd of September 2020, when she was just 16 months old, she was beaten to death by Savannah Brockhill, a woman who described herself as, quote, the #1 psycho. This happened while Star's mother, Frankie Smith, who was also the partner of Brockhill, stood by and did nothing to protect her child. The murder was a culmination of months of abuse, which left Star's tiny body, massive bruises, and fractured bones. The court case revealed the true extent of Smith and Brockill's evil, including CCTV being played, taken a few days before Star was murdered, showing her being punched and slapped around 20 times by Brockhill, and dragged through the streets of Bradford by Smith, clearly in pain, while suffering from a broken leg. This is a heartbreaking story about the death of an innocent. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Star Alicia Hobson was born at 6:56 a.m. on Tuesday the 21st of May 2019 at Bradford Royal Infirmary. She weighed 7 pounds 7 ounces. She stayed in hospital for the first 2 weeks of her life due to feeding difficulties, but she was soon thriving. Her life would come to an end just 16 months later, on the 22nd of September 2020, but during her short time on this earth, she touched the lives of many. After her death, her maternal great-grandparents, David Fawcett and Anita Smith, recalled the beautiful little girl who they instantly fell in love with. After her death, David remembered how his great-granddaughter loved to dance. He said, quote, Anita used to pick her up and dance around the kitchen with her. She had a little baby walker she used to sit in and go across the kitchen and dance up and down to the tunes. It was brilliant. She used to stare. That was the thing I'll never forget. She'd look at me, and she'd be staring at you. And you'd look away, and she'd still be staring. Her Aunt Alicia said the Star was, quote, very special. She loved music and dancing and shaking her head. She had the best personality I've ever known. She loved chocolate, especially twirl. They were a favourite. She was cheeky. She used to do a little fake laugh, and it made me laugh every single time. Some mornings, we would get up super early, just to play and mess about. She loved cuddles and kisses as well. She couldn't give you enough of them. She would pin me down and cover me with kisses. Moments I will forever cherish. Star also loved snuggling on the sofa, watching Peppa Pig, and she liked Weetabix for breakfast. The thing that stands out in the photos of Star are her beautiful blue eyes. They're so big, so innocent. How anyone could harm this little angel is beyond my understanding, but this is exactly what happened. More than half of Star's short life was characterised by physical and emotional abuse at the hands of two evil women, her own mother and a deranged partner who described herself as a psycho. Frankie Smith, Star's mother, although she wasn't fit to use this title, was born in June 2000 and grew up in the town of Shipley in West Yorkshire. She was the daughter of Yvonne and Andrew and was one of 5 children. Members of her family have stated they have no idea how Smith grew into the monster she became, with them remembering her love of musicals when she was a child, with her regularly being taken to stage shows, including Shishi Shishi Bang Bang and Jersey Boys. She was also obsessed with a 1970s band called the Rubettes, especially the lead singer Alan Williams, despite him being old enough to be her grandfather. But there were indicators of instability in the home. Andrew was a heroin addict who spent much of his time locked in his room, and he eventually died of an overdose. The influence of Yvonne was more damaging, I'll get to her soon. Frankie Smith had significant disadvantages in her life. In court, it was stated that an assessment had showed that she had an IQ of 70, meaning that she had a learning disability, and was in the bottom 2% of the population in terms of intelligence. In addition, it was noted that she was, quote, abnormally compliant and abnormally prone to going along with what an authority figure is telling her to do. Smith was extremely immature. Her family stated that she played with dolls until she was 16 years old. Smith didn't seem to have much interest in boys, but this changed when she began a relationship with a man called Star Hobson, and she soon fell pregnant. As stated earlier, Smith gave birth to Star in May 2019, but her relationship with Jordan quickly fell apart. According to someone who knew the couple, the relationship was toxic and volatile. Jordan, sometime later, would be in court for attacking his new girlfriend with a mop. As will be covered later, Jordan did contact the police when he saw pictures of his daughter with injuries on her face, but it appears he was an absent father who had almost no contact with Star during her short life. Initially, Frankie Smith dozed on Star, but within weeks she got bored of her and would go out on benders with her mother Yvonne, while Star was left with other family members or palmed off onto babysitters. Soon, Star became an inconvenience, and Smith's behaviour towards her quickly changed. This was witnessed by Alicia, Smith's half-sister, and Star's aunt. Whilst Alicia adored Star, and the pair were very close, Smith called her own daughter, when she was only a few months old, it, and a cunt. In October 2019, on a night out, Frankie Smith, by this point 18 years old, met Savannah Brockhill, a deeply disturbed 26-year-old woman who was possessive and dangerous, and who was working as a bouncer at the Sun pub in Bradford. The pair exchanged numbers, and within a few weeks were in a toxic relationship. This meeting of two evil minds will result in the abuse, torment, and eventual murder of Star Hobson, just 11 months later. Savannah Brockhill was born around 1993 and came from a large traveller family where many of the men were involved in boxing, both licensed and unlicensed. It's reported that her paternal grandfather and the father of former world heavyweight champion boxer Tyson Fury, known as the Gypsy King, were cousins. The family appeared to have a lot of money, and a reporter was later shown a picture of Brockhill when she was younger, posing with Tyson Fury, along with one of her siblings called Scarlett, whilst both were wearing mink coats, each costing around £5,000. The huge family resided on a compound in Lancashire, with properties, including luxury caravans and chalets, being valued at around £1.5 million in total. Brockhill left school at the age of 10 to take on duties in the family home, but she excelled at boxing and apparently earned a £1,500 a month grant to train full-time with the British women's boxing team. She was on her way to competing in the Olympics, but her dream was ended when her spine was damaged in a serious car accident when she was 19 years old. Until her mid-20s, Savannah Brockhill, astonishingly, considering her complete lack of empathy, worked as a home carer, helping the elderly, but she also worked as a pub bouncer and later trained as a security dog handler. She also bred Staffordshire Terriers, and her father reckoned she could clear £8,000 a month. Where Brockhill and her family got their money from is a really big question, and I think the fact that she clearly grew up being given everything she ever wanted is likely where her sense of entitlement comes from, her belief that people should do what she says, regardless of what they want. Savannah Brockhill was a lesbian, and had a number of relationships, and at least one of these she's reported as having been violent and controlling, resulting in her being made subject to a restraining order in 2015. However, this single incident is likely the tip of the iceberg, because as we'll see, Brockhill was an extremely dangerous, possessive domestic abuser, who likely, in large part due to her jealousy about the attention an infant was getting from her mother, would abuse and eventually murder Star Hobson. This section will cover a lot, and we'll look at the toxic relationship between Frankie Smith and Savannah Brockhill, which is intertwined with the abuse of Star Hobson, but we'll also look at professional failings in this case, which meant that an innocent little girl was left in the clutches of monsters. I'll cover most of the key incidents, but there were many, many more. Details of the abuse in the chronology I'm taking from the National Review into Starr's murder. So, with regards to Smith and Brockhill, within weeks of their first meeting in October 2019, they were in a relationship, and the warning flags were there immediately. The pair were obsessed with each other. Between the date that they first met and the murder of Starr less than a year later, they were always in contact. In court, thousands upon thousands of messages and phone logs were exhibited which showed they were in contact morning, noon and night. Despite only having been together for a short time, Smith would tell people that Brockhill was her wife and that Starr was their child. In a baby book she had, to document Starr's life, she'd written Brockhill's name in a box where the name of the father was meant to appear. Smith also got Brockhill's name tattooed on herself. Starr was forced to treat this woman she hardly knew as her second mother. Brockhill bizarrely began by saying that Starr was her sister, before telling people, in line with Smith, that she was her daughter. All of this was in around the first month of their relationship. As I'll outline, both Smith and Brockhill would abuse Starr, both physically and emotionally, with the latter's level of violence being sadistic. When this began is unclear, but it was likely immediately, with the first signs being noticed in January 2020. On the 23rd of January, a young woman called Holly Jones, who adored Starr, and the feeling was mutual, was babysitting her, which was a regular occurrence, as Smith, her mother Yvonne, and Brockhill would go out on the piss most nights. Holly noticed bruises on Starr's body. She then made an anonymous call to the Social Services Department at Bradford City Council, raising her concerns. This led to a visit by a social worker a few days later, and Holly was present during this. However, she stated later that the social worker called an hour ahead of time, saying she was coming. This led to 60 frantic minutes, while Smith and Brockhill covered up Starr's bruises. As Holly later stated, quote, "It's like ringing up a criminal an hour before and saying, 'I'm coming to get you.' It just doesn't really make sense." At the visit, no concerns were noted, and the case was closed. In February 2020, family members were concerned that Starr looked depressed and frightened. Brockhill would often have pictures taken with Starr, and in these, you can see this little girl looks terrified and uncomfortable. This is also evident in this video.
My princess girl. Who's a pretty girl? Who's a pretty girl? Who's spoiled? Who's spoiled? Can I knock my cheek back? Is it good to be stuck to yours like glue or something? Pretty girl. You a spoiled pretty girl. Round around the garden like a teddy bear. Round around the garden like a teddy bear. One step, two step, tickly everywhere. Serious girl, aren't you? Are you serious? Deadly.
During this same month, the instability of Brockhill was on full display. She was obsessively jealous, and she would send message after message to Smith, accusing her of cheating on her with men. On the 29th of February 2020, she sent an unhinged message to one of Smith's sisters, where she'd convinced herself of her partner's infidelity. It read, quote, "I'm broken. I'll stab someone tonight, I swear. I don't care about kids in the house. I will rage. Fuck it. They're going to need police in the house to take me away." She also posted this deranged video on Facebook.
Guys and girls need to remember the fact that Frankie is with me. She keeps getting a lot of message requests and friends requests she's not going to accept. Especially tramps like yous. And if you want to keep your kneecaps, I suggest you stop sending her them. She's with the #1 psycho.
Savannah Brockhill would also be Frankie Smith, and this was suspected to have occurred from early in the relationship, as she had bruises on her face, and this was confirmed when Yvonne, Smith's mother, saw Brockhill punch her daughter in the head when they went to a pub on the 14th of March 2020. The reason for this assault? Smith apparently had a fleeting conversation with a man at the bar. Brockhill then grabbed Smith's arm, called her a whore, and locked her in a bathroom cubicle. Eventually, she was let out, and the pair then got into Brockhill's car and drove away. The next day, Brockhill texted a friend of hers saying that she considered killing both herself and Smith by driving off a cliff, but had instead decided to just give her a beating. She closed this message by saying, quote, "I'm out of control." Star was, at this point, safe and experiencing what would be the last few weeks of stability, protection, and love she would ever know. This was due to her being taken in by her maternal great-grandparents, David Fawcett and Anita Smith, in February 2020, after Smith had dumped her daughter with them and said she couldn't cope, as she and Savannah Brockhill had broken up, which was something that happened on a regular basis. When Star arrived at her great-grandparents', she had very bad nappy rash, but when this was treated, she thrived. She went from this to this. For 2 months, Star was happy, but this would all come to an end when on the 26th of April 2020, 5 months before the murder, Smith arrived unannounced and took Star back to live with her and Brockhill. They never saw her alive again. After this point, they were banned from seeing their great-granddaughter. This was apparently at the direction of Brockhill. On the 4th of May 2020, Anita apparently learned that Brockhill had destroyed Star's dummy in front of her, forced her to eat garlic, and slam-choked her, essentially grabbed her by the neck and banged her against a wall to, quote, toughen her up. Anita immediately called Bradford Social Services. This is referral number 2. A few days later, the social worker, who was described as inexperienced in the subsequent review, went round and decided, after seeing Star and Brockhill for a short time, that the pair had a good relationship and there were no concerns. Apparently, from the reports I've read, Anita knew that Star had been choked because she's seen a video of this, but it's not clear who took this. However, it's quite likely it was Smith and or Brockhill, as they would regularly film themselves tormenting Star. Police were able to recover multiple videos and pictures of Star being psychologically abused, with her distress being a source of entertainment for her tormentors. In one recovered video, Star was clearly desperately in need of sleep, as she was filmed sitting in a flimsy chair before falling asleep and toppling off, hitting her head on the floor. This was filmed by both Smith and Brockhill, who were laughing throughout. Brockhill then added music to her footage and added a caption which read, quote, "I've laughed so hard," before sending it to friends of hers. Later that day, another video was filmed of Star having a plate of food placed in front of her. She was so sleepy that she fell forward with her head in the bowl. Rather than helping her daughter, Smith simply laughed. Several videos and photographs were also found, with Star being forced to stand in the corner. These were often taken by Smith, who would then send them to Brockhill. This was part of their sadistic pleasure in tormenting Star and documenting the abuse. For example, Star was forced to stand in the corner after the following conversation between the pair. Smith said, quote, "Star keeps crying, I don't know why, it's proper crying, she's proper crying." Brockhill tells her to put Star in the corner, and when told she's already there, she says good. The photo is then sent to Brockhill, with Star standing in the corner. Notice Smith calling her daughter it. She did this constantly. Tormenting this child was not something that either of these monsters hid. CCTV footage was recorded of their despicable abuse, with one particular clip showing the absolute callousness of Brockhill. In the footage shown in court, Smith, Brockhill and Star were walking down some stairs from the block of flats where they lived, and Star was clearly struggling to traverse the steps. She was clinging to the railings. In the video, Smith and Brockhill are at the foot of the stairs watching Star, as Smith goes to help her daughter. Brockhill puts an arm across Smith, stopping her. Star then falls down the last few steps, landing on her head. She's then simply dragged off the floor and yanked away. On the 21st of June 2020, Star's father Jordan contacted the Emergency Social Services duty team to say that he wanted to send some pictures of bruising on Star's face that had been sent to him by a relative. It appears that these had been taken by someone who was taking care of Star, and they had been sent around the family. He was advised to call the police, which he did. A police officer from West Yorkshire Police went round and saw 3 bruises on Star's face. Smith said these were as a result of Star banging her head on a coffee table. The social services emergency duty team and police safeguarding team agreed that a child protection medical was needed. The medical examination occurred the same day, and it was concluded that the injuries were consistent with the explanation given by Star's mother. Despite this being the third call of concern, no further action was taken. A few days later, still in June 2020, Rachel Whiteley, a family friend, called social services after witnessing Frankie Smith grabbing hold of Star roughly at a barbecue. It appears nothing was done with this report. On the 3rd of July 2020, Frankie Smith moved into a flat which had been offered to her by a social housing project. It was a place where only she was allowed to live with Star, but Savannah Brockhill was a regular visitor. This was a flat in Wesley Place on Halifax Road in Kiley, the property where Star's life would come to an end less than 3 months later. Here, in the new flat, in early August 2020, the month before the murder, Star's babysitter, the woman who had raised the first alarm, Holly Jones, was front and centre to the abuse in the home. She later reported that she'd been at the property feeding Star food when, quote, "My finger got in the way and she bit my finger. I don't think she realised it was my finger. I shouted out. Savannah turned round and saw it and shouted at Frankie, 'What's she going to do? She just bit Holly.' Frankie turned round and bit Star's finger. Star started screaming. She said something like, 'That'll teach you not to bite people.' It left a mark." So by this point, there had been 4 referrals to social services, and the police had also been called, and no one had put 2 and 2 together. Despite Star being mercilessly abused, she was left in the hands of 2 monsters. She was now, in August 2020, just a month away from the end of her life. At the end of August, and the beginning of September 2020, there was at least one more missed opportunity to save the life of Star Hobson, but this should be the last, as she was in the final weeks of her life, which, like half of her short time on this earth, would be characterised by fear and sadistic physical abuse, eventually ending with her being beaten to death. On the 27th of August 2020, Star was being looked after by a family friend, and they took a video of her face, which showed clear bruising, as well as what appeared to be finger marks. This video was sent to Star's maternal uncle Benjamin Smith and paternal great-grandfather Frank Smith. Ben immediately called West Yorkshire Police, who went to speak to Smith, but she avoided them. When she spoke to officers on the phone, she said that she, Brockhill and Star were in Scotland, an obvious lie, which they didn't look into, and this wasn't followed up. It took a couple of days for Frank to see the video, and when he did see it, on the 2nd of September, he immediately called social services. This was the 5th and final referral, the last opportunity to save Star's life. The social worker called Smith, and she simply stated that Star had injured herself when she fell over. At 11 AM on the 4th of September 2020, the social worker went to visit the flat. They hadn't seen the video of the bruises on Star's face, or even pictures of these injuries. The social worker saw Star, Smith and Brockhill, and they noted that both women had a good bond with the child, and they had no concerns. In fact, Smith and Brockhill were spinning their lies, claiming that Frank, the great-grandfather, was a homophobe, and that his allegations were simply because he didn't approve of their relationship. On the 15th of September 2020, just 7 days before Star's death, social services closed their case on the basis that concerns raised by Frank were malicious. Just 2 days before the case was closed, on Sunday the 13th of September 2020, Star would suffer a vicious assault, which would mean that she spent her last days alive in excruciating pain. On this date, because Frankie Smith wanted to go out drinking, Savannah Brockhill was left in charge of Star, but she also had to go to work. She couldn't find anyone else to look after Star, and so she took her to her night shift as a security guard at the Eco Power recycling plant in Rossington, near Doncaster. Her arriving at the plant was captured on CCTV. What has not been released, but what the jury later had to watch, was Brockhill returning to the car repeatedly over the space of 3 hours and assaulting Star approximately 21 times, including slapping and punching her in the face and punching her body, as well as grabbing her. At one point, Star fell out of the car and was thrown back in by Brockhill. All during this time, Brockhill and Smith were arguing via text. It's no coincidence that Star was suffering the consequences of the toxic relationship between the pair. The next morning, Star was returned to the care of Smith, and police found that she'd taken a photo of a large bruise on her daughter's face, and there had been a back and forward argument between her and Brockhill, where Smith said, quote, "Stay away from us." Of course this wouldn't last. This was just part of a pattern with this toxic relationship. The bruise on Star's face was the least of her injuries. It's likely that the savage assault she was subjected to on the 13th of September resulted in many of the injuries found at her autopsy, including a broken leg, broken ribs, and damage to her internal organs. Frankie Smith and Savannah Brockill's pathetic and childish relationship continued, constant arguing, phone calls morning, noon and night. It's clear both were dependent on each other. Sickeningly, they continued to bond over their apparent hatred of Star. On Saturday the 19th of September 2020, Smith took a video of Star, who had a broken leg and internal injuries, stood in a corner, apparently as punishment. She was sending messages disparaging her little girl to Brockhill, who responded saying, quote, "She's a very nasty and naughty child, and she's a brat who thinks nothing of you." The next day, Sunday the 20th of September 2020, CCTV was captured of Frankie Smith dragging Star around Bradford city centre on her reins. Star was struggling to walk because of her broken leg and was having difficulty keeping her head upright. At one point, Star fell over and was dragged off the floor by Smith, who held her like a puppet on strings. Star Hobson would have been in excruciating pain from head to toe. Smith later said in court that she had no idea her daughter was in pain and believed she was just having a tantrum. What happened on the afternoon of Tuesday the 22nd of September 2020, the day Star Hobson died, will never be known for sure. What is known is that at 2:54 p.m, Savannah Brockhill parked her vehicle in the car park outside the flat in Weston Place on Halifax Road in Kiley, and Frankie Smith came to meet her before they were seen walking back towards the door into the complex. In the flat were 3 children, Star and 2 others. It's not clear who the other children were, but what is known is that one of them was a little boy, aged around 2.5, and they were there for a play date. Soon after entering the property, Savannah Brockhill launched a final vicious assault against 16-month-old Star Hobson. Brockhill kicked and punched Star, as well as lightly stamping on her over and over again. Brockhill fractured her skull and broke more of her ribs. It was later stated that the injuries that Star sustained were delivered with a massive amount of force, and they were similar to those someone would sustain in a serious car crash. Star also suffered a laceration measuring 2 cm by 2 cm to her inferior vena cava, the main blood vessel taking blood back to the heart. This caused massive internal injuries. Star Hobson bled to death. At her autopsy, it was found that 50% of her circulating blood was found to have leaked into her abdomen. The fatal punch or kick which caused the injury also damaged Star's internal organs, including her liver, pancreas and kidneys. While Star lay dying, at 3:34 p.m, Brockhill was searching on the internet. She typed in, quote, "shocking babies and how to bring a baby out of shock." Clearly she was hoping she could find some magic remedy which would mean that this evil pair could simply patch up Star, continue to get away with their crimes and use her as a punching bag. But this time, there would be no saving Star. She was on the brink of death. The timeline is important to point out, as it shows that within 30 minutes of arriving at the property, Brockhill had beaten Star to death. The reason for this savage beating has never been revealed, but Brockhill's internet searches and messages between her and Smith give one likely scenario. 4 days before the murder, Frankie Smith was complaining to Savannah Brockhill that Star had apparently ripped up a concert ticket signed by Anna Williams, a member of the Rubettes band, which she'd been obsessed with since she was a child. At 3:03 p.m. on the day of the murder, 9 minutes after she arrived, Brockhill searched for a replacement autograph ticket online. So I think what potentially happened was that Brockhill turned up. Smith immediately began talking about the autographed ticket her daughter had ripped up. This to these sick women was not the act of a little girl who was likely just playing. This was a sign of Star's evil, how much of a brat she was. Brockhill then looked for a replacement ticket online and likely began berating Star before savagely beating her. So potentially, Star was murdered because of a ripped up ticket. After delaying for around 11 minutes, Savannah Brockhill finally called the emergency services, having quickly come up with a weak cover story to explain away the numerous injuries which covered the body of Star Hobson. See if you can spot the obvious red flags on this call and just how evil she is.
Under the service, is the patient breathing?
Yeah, she's breathing.
Is she conscious?
Yeah. She's a bit of both, really. Basically, it's my partner's daughter. It's my little girl as well. I brought her up. We've got all three children here playing, and I was in the kitchen making a coffee, and they've been in the living room, and I heard a bang. So I came out, and the little lad stood there, and the little girl's on the floor, and she was crying, and then she stopped crying, and then she was sick, and now she's just a little bit floppy, to be honest with you.
And what do you know what the bang was?
No, I don't know I don't know if she's fallen off of the sofa, or I don't know. Just the three of them playing with us. And
right.
he just said start, and when I walked in, she was laid on the floor. Shush, darling.
So you heard a bang, the patient was on the floor.
I've heard a bang, yeah. I came in, and the little lad was saying Star, which is the little girl.
Yeah.
So I shouted to Mummy to sit up, Star. So I sat her up, and I started to rub her back because she was like breathing but like struggling.
Yeah.
So I was rubbing her back. She started to be sick, so I led her on the floor.
Yeah.
Put her in like CPR position, started to run her back. She started to lose breath, so I performed CPR on her.
So you've done CPR on her?
Yeah, I've done CPR. I've got her in the recovery position now.
So as a starting point, when I listen to something like this, I think about how I would react if my child, or the child of a friend, was seriously ill. I wouldn't be calm at all. I definitely wouldn't be having essentially a chat with the operator. I'd be screaming at them to get here now. Also, did you notice Brockhill was subtly trying to blame one of the other children who was there for what had happened, specifically the 2.5-year-old little boy who was there for a play date. Lastly, these idiots seem to throw in CPR because they think it makes them look innocent. They seem to forget that doing this is extremely tiring. Brockhill would have likely been out of breath if she had done this to Star, but nope, she's just chatting away, happy as Larry. This nonchalant manner and further warning signs were also seen by the paramedics who attended. They were Wendy Durkin and Andy Campbell. They rated to a Category 1 incident, as serious as it gets, but when they got to the location at 4 p.m, they were met by Savannah Brockhill in the car park of the flat complex, and she was cool as a cucumber. Andy later reported, quote, "She was walking over quite slowly. She said the patient was upstairs in the flat. She wasn't crying, she didn't seem to be panicked. Her movement was slow. There was no urgency as we went up to the flat. She said the child was unattended and she heard a bang. She said she found the girl floppy and had performed CPR." Wendy also noticed that Brockhill was very calm and had no urgency in her voice whatsoever, which she said was not normal. I'd expect someone to be worried about their child, panicking and rushing. Brockhill even admitted to Wendy, instead of calling 999 immediately, she'd make Google searches about how to treat a baby suffering from shock. Wendy described entering the flat, where she saw, quote, "very pale, almost lifeless child, lying on her front, wearing only a nappy. The breathing was very shallow. If we didn't intervene straight away, it was a cardiac arrest situation. We knew she was gravely ill, and we needed to move quickly." Frankie Smith, who was simply stood there gormlessly, also appeared to show no emotion, and both she and Brockhill claimed the latter had performed CPR on Star. However, they then gestured that this had involved pressing Star's abdomen and not her chest, clearly the wrong way to do it. Whilst the paramedics scooped up Star and rushed to the ambulance, Brockhill took her time getting a coat and phone. She was in no rush and showed no emotion. With regard to Smith, she too had to be told to hurry up and seemed to be dragging her feet. Only at the back of the ambulance did Frankie Smith begin to show any emotion, and she began crying. This wasn't remorse for her actions, this was because she knew she was in trouble. These were tears for herself. Soon after setting off, Star went to cardiac arrest. She was rushed straight into resus when the ambulance arrived at Airedale General Hospital at 4:37 p.m. Doctors worked for 20 minutes to save her life, but at 4:59 p.m. on Tuesday the 22nd of September 2020, 16-month-old Star Hobson was pronounced dead. While sitting next to the dead body of her daughter, Frankie Smith made remarks that Star had been, quote, a tough one who played hard, but that she had been too soft on her. The medical staff were appalled by her callousness. The autopsy of Star's body showed that she suffered months of abuse. This was a mass of broken bones, both old and new, bruises and scratch marks over her entire body. Her death was determined to have been due to catastrophic internal injuries caused by sustained physical assault, i.e. she had been murdered. Approximately 3 days after Star's death, her mother Frankie Smith and her partner Savannah Brockhill were arrested on suspicion of murder. Both Smith and Brockhill were interviewed repeatedly by the police. As evidence was gathered, they were asked to account for it, and there was an overwhelming amount. All of the text messages, the videos, pictures of injuries, all of the searches completed by Brockhill, the disgusting way that both referred to Star. But each of them gave nothing away in interview, with them refusing to account for Star's death or the horrific injuries which covered her tiny body. The pair were both charged with murder and remanded into prison to await their fate in court. Both were unapologetic and pleaded not guilty to the charges, forcing a trial at Bradford Crown Court, which began on Wednesday the 20th of October 2021 and lasted 7 weeks. Both offenders gave evidence. The strategy for Frankie Smith's legal counsel was clear. She was a terrible woman who had no right to call herself a mother, but this didn't necessarily make her a murderer. Her own barrister said, quote, Frankie Smith was a terrible mother. She was selfish and sometimes callous and cruel to her own daughter. Her behaviour was more than immature and ignorant. Her behaviour was simply terrible. Frankie Smith's priorities were all clearly wrong. However, they said that while she was an unfit mother, she was a follower, not a leader. The driving force was Savannah Brockhill. To illustrate their point, they referenced the assessment I've mentioned earlier, where it was reported that Smith had an extremely low IQ and was abnormally prone to following the lead of others. They also referenced Smith's physical frame compared to that of her older and much stronger co-accused. Smith lent into her defence fully. When giving evidence, she stated that she was scared of Brockhill, and that only in retrospect could she see that screaming at her daughter and filming her in distress was wrong. She also pleaded ignorance to knowing that, in her final days, Star was in constant pain, suffering from a broken leg. Her attempts to wriggle out of responsibility were disgusting. As to the murder itself, Smith said that she was out of the room and so had not killed Star and couldn't comment on who did. With regards to Brockhill, she wriggled and squirmed on the stand, minimising her culpability and a level of violence towards Star. She had to admit that she'd assaulted Star, as this had been caught on CCTV, but despite her clearly being captured, hitting this defenceless child at least 21 times, Brockhill said that she'd struck Star once, and only because she was being naughty. For 7 weeks the jury had to go through every detail of the abuse and murder of Star Hobson, but it's her family that I feel most sympathy for. They had to sit hearing about what Star went through, knowing that the reality was far worse than what they'd feared, that they and she had been utterly failed by the authorities. On Tuesday the 14th of December 2021, the jury returned their verdicts. Frankie Smith was found not guilty of murder, but convicted of causing or allowing the death of her own 16-month-old daughter, i.e. she knew exactly what was going on and did nothing to safeguard Star. However, Savannah Brockhill was found guilty of the murder of Star Hobson. The next day, Wednesday the 15th of December 2021, both appeared for sentencing in front of Mrs. Justice Lambert. She addressed both parties stating, quote, "The physical injuries that Star suffered during her life are only part, if a significant part, of the tragic story of her life. She was also treated with the best callous indifference by you both, and on many occasions with frank cruelty. The question which those who have watched the evidence of this trial unfold will be asking is why anyone would or could behave in such a way towards a young and vulnerable child who should be cherished and protected rather than abused and neglected. The answer to that question is clear to me. Star was caught in the crossfire of your relationship. The detail of that relationship is graphically illustrated in the many hundreds of social media messages that you sent to each other and to those who know you. Those messages concern petty squabbles and jealous fights. Often fueled by alcohol, those fights quickly escalated into an exchange of violent threats and ultimatums which were obviously meaningless to you both and quickly forgotten by you. Star was, however, the victim of these pointless and self-absorbed rows. You, Savannah Brockhill, took your anger out on Star by punching and slapping her. Frankie, you were cruel towards Star, punishing her pointlessly for perceived bad behaviour. She then sentenced them for allowing her daughter to be abused and eventually murdered. 20-year-old Frankie Smith was sentenced to 8 years in prison, but the next year the Court of Appeal increased this to 12 years, which I think is still a pathetic sentence. For the murder of Star Hobson, 28-year-old Savannah Brockhill was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 25 years. Smith was directed to serve 2/3 of her sentence before release, so she'll be out after serving 8 years, and taking off time she spent on remand, she'll likely be released in around 2028. I mean, this is appalling. Smith will be around 27 years old when she's released, with her whole life ahead of her, while she stood by and watched her daughter's future being snatched away from her. For Brockhill, she'll be eligible for parole in around 2045, when she'll be 52 years old. There have been no reports about Frankie Smith's time in custody. It will have been tough, and I suspect she's probably had beatings over the years. With Savannah Brockhill, she poked her head back up the month after the sentence when she gave an interview from prison to the Daily Mail in January 2022. Her rambling showed just how deranged, evil and remorseless she is. During this interview, Brockhill tried to rewrite history in the most sickening way, stating, quote, "I loved Star, the more so because she was born on my mother's birthday, the 21st of May. She had the bluest eyes you've ever seen, and she just wanted to play. I learned her round and round the garden, and she'd put her hands out and just want to do it. She'd fall asleep holding my fingers. She was always clinging to me." According to this monster, it was Frankie Smith who had taken the lead in abusing Star and had been the one who actually murdered her. Brockhill had only kept quiet in court to protect her former partner, but now she was going to appeal so that the truth came out, so that she could counter all the lies she claimed were presented in court. She also denied reports that she'd been attacked in prison. Thankfully, it seems that Brockhill's threats to appeal have come to nothing. I can see nothing about her trying to wriggle out of her just deserts. This would come to nothing anyway. She's a monster, that's clear, and she's exactly where she belongs. Potentially, she too has had a beating or two in prison, but I fear that, given the deranged, violent psychopath she is, she will likely be the one who's victimising others. I hope with all of my heart that she never gets released from prison. If she is ever released, I hope that her inevitable false name is exposed and her location published, so she never gets a moment of peace. The serious case review was completed to identify which professionals were at fault for the death of Star Hobson, and it was clear that the social services team at Bradford City Council had utterly failed this little girl. In May 2022, 8 months after Star's death, the head of the council, Councillor Susan Hinchcliffe, released an apology. Part of it read, quote, "On behalf of the council, I want to say sorry to Star's family that signs were missed and that we did not take the action we should have. I will go through the findings of the subsequent report and the learning that it claimed had been implemented and how things would now be completely fine, but I won't bother. This is what I've said in so many videos before, and they're just words that stick in my throat as nothing seems to change. All the words of apology and all the promises of change, pointless. Star Hobson is still dead. Next month would have been her 6th birthday. This highlights to me just how young she was, just how defenceless she was. Her murder was made even more horrific because it came just 3 months after the killing of 6-year-old Arthur Labinjo Hughes, a little boy who was tortured, neglected and beaten to death by his pathetic father and his evil partner, whose cries that no one loved him were caught on camera and which are truly heartbreaking. Whilst this video is primarily about Star Hobson, I want us all to remember not only her, but also Arthur Labinjo Hughes, Victoria Climbié, Peter Connolly, Keanu Williams, Lola James, Logan Mwangi, and so many others. Fly high, little angels. I mentioned the murder of 6-year-old Arthur Labinjo Hughes in the previous section. The parallels between that horrific case and this one are disturbing, both in terms of the circumstances of his death, but also the profiles of the perpetrators. So Arthur was neglected and abused by his father Thomas Hughes and his partner Emma Tustin, before the latter beat him to death in June 2020. The pair had only been together for 8 months at the time of Arthur's death. As speculated in that video, it was not likely a man would go from a normal loving father to being complicit in his son's torture and murder in less than a year, and concluded that Tustin simply built on hatred that Hughes already had for his child. She was a pathetic woman, completely dependent on relationships, and she wanted Hughes all to herself. They bonded over the abuse of Arthur, but he was, ultimately, an object that needed to be disposed of so that she could have all of his attention, and eventually Tustin removed him from the picture completely. Reflecting this onto the current case, you have Frankie Smith, a woman who had Star but quickly lost interest in her. She likely loved the attention that having a newborn brought her, but Star needed love and attention, and Smith had no interest in providing this, and her daughter soon became an inconvenience. Smith had a low IQ, yes, but this doesn't absolve her of anything, as far as I'm concerned. She still knew right from wrong. She simply didn't care. I think the greatest influence on Smith was her mother Yvonne, someone she would go out and get pissed with, instead of looking after her daughter. Yvonne's name pops up a few times in reports I've read, but it appears that she knew most of what was going on, including that Savannah Brockhill was a violent and stable thug, but she did nothing. Also notice how Yvonne was not one of the people who called social services. I think this woman's neglectful behaviour is where Frankie Smith's utter indifference to the care of Star stemmed from. As the weeks went by, Frankie Smith began to despise Star. She was an it, a thing, and then she met Savannah Brockhill, who would use this hatred to her advantage. With regard to Brockhill's background, we know almost nothing about her upbringing, aside from the fact that she grew up in a traveller community. But whatever happened during this time essentially destroyed any chance she had of growing up to be a fully functioning adult. I think it's likely that she was neglected and or abused as a child, which left her with incredibly low self-esteem and a pathological fear of rejection. She was a woman who was jealous of the attention an infant was getting, who saw them as a rival, and this only comes from a deep dark place of absolute insecurity. I think her childhood was likely characterised by violence, whether this was in the home or elsewhere, and this normalised the horrific acts she went on to commit. She was likely taught that violence was a way to solve any issue, a way to gain respect, a way to keep people in line, to get what you wanted. I think everything that Brockhill did, the boxing, her jobs and security, were all her desperate attempts at fronting, to portray to others how strong she was, how tough she was. But the reality is that she was utterly pathetic and weak, constantly terrified of being abandoned. But a mask fell away completely when it came to relationships. She was terrified of being rejected. She needed to control her partners as quickly as possible. When she met Frankie Smith, she saw an easy mark, someone with issues who she could utterly dominate. And so, like so many other domestic abusers, the relationship progressed at breakneck speed. This was all about Brockhill having utter control over Smith. However, she was constantly jealous. Just how deranged and insecure Brockhill was is shown by the Facebook post where she felt the need to essentially warn off anyone from messaging or talking to Smith because they were together. If Brockhill could have stopped Smith from talking to anyone apart from her, I've no doubt she would have done. But while she could post this online and get people to back off, Star was still there. She was still in the way. As I just said, at the core of this case is the fact that Savannah Brockhill, pathetic piece of shit that she is, was jealous and intimidated by an infant. Brockhill saw the pre-existing indifference that Smith had to her daughter, and she fanned the flames. Brockhill dehumanised Star, making her out to be a naughty child, and she and Smith bonded through their abuse of her. They laughed and joked together, all at the expense of this little girl. Their behaviour was sadistic. They got a sick thrill from hurting Star, and I returned to Brockhill's various searches after she'd assaulted this child. Some of them, I think, were her looking up whether she might have gone too far in what she was doing, but others, I think, with her looking up what damage Star was suffering and revelling in the fact that she had caused her specific types of pain and distress. Star was also Brockhill's personal punching bag. It wasn't her unstable personality which meant that her relationship was toxic. Why her and Smith kept arguing, it was all Star's fault. And then there was the final assault. By this point, Smith hated Star as much as Brockhill did, and the latter felt confident she could do whatever she wanted to this 16-month-old. And so she did. She beat her to death, potentially due to her simply ripping up a ticket. This was just 11 months after Smith and Brockhill had first laid eyes on each other. After the murder, neither Smith nor Brockhill could even pretend to care. Frankie Smith is a horrific woman, a terrible excuse for a mother who should never be allowed to have children again, but Savannah Brockhill is another level of evil, a monster who beat a defenceless girl to death, who, in the aftermath, was likely ecstatic. Her partner was all hers, and her main rival, an infant, was dead. She'd won. Being blunt, fuck the pair of them. With regards to Brockhill especially, I hope she rots in prison, and if she's ever released, she's never given a moment's peace, is hounded for the rest of her life, and eventually dies, miserable and alone.